Can someone simply be autistic? Or is a diagnosis really dependent on having a disorder that impacts how they function in, certain situations?
Yeah, that's really the heart of it, isn't it? It gets at how we understand these conditions and, well, how things are always evolving.
And how even small changes in the rule book, so to speak, can have huge effects.
Absolutely. Huge ripple effects.
So today we're digging into an article by Dr. Jaime Hoerricks, Autism and Place. The changes to the DSM link neurotype, disability, and place like never before.
Right, focusing on those recent updates for autism spectrum disorder in the DSM-5-TR.
And the DSM, for anyone maybe less familiar, is basically the handbook clinicians use for diagnoses. So these changes, they really matter.
Oh, definitely. This isn't just, academic talk, how we define autism. It hits identity, access to support, how society sees neurodiversity. Dr. Hoerricks really highlights that impact.
Yeah, they argue that what looks like a minor tweak in the DSM-5-TR could actually really change who gets diagnosed and maybe how we even think about autism.
They even predicted a potential drop in prevalence back in 2022, right?
Exactly, and a 2025 update seems to, well, bear that concern out.
So our goal today isn't just listing the changes. We want to unpack them, see what they might mean in the real world, explore the bigger questions,
Exactly. What does it mean to be autistic now? We want to break it down, explore the consequences, and hopefully give you, the listener, a clearer picture.
A clearer overview of something that's pretty complex and definitely evolving.
Okay, so where do we start with these DSM shifts? What's the actual change?
I think the best place is Criterion B for autism spectrum disorder. In the DSM-5-TR, the latest version, the part about restricted repetitive behaviors, it's gotten stricter.
Right. Okay. So before in the DSM-5, Criterion B said something like, as manifested by at least two of the following, and then listed 4 types.
Precisely. And those 4 were, first, repetitive movements, using objects in repetitive ways, or speech patterns like echolalia.
Okay.
Second, needing things to be the same, sticking rigidly to routines, ritualized behaviors. Third, those really intense, focused interests. The ones that are unusual in how strong they are. And fourth, being either hyper or hyporeactive to sensory stuff, or having unusual sensory interests.
Okay, so previously you just needed to show signs of like 2 of those 4 categories.
Right, at least 2.
Yeah.
But the DSM-5-TR, it changes the wording significantly.
How so?
It now says Criterion B is as manifested by all of the following.
Wait, all? Not just 2?
All 4. Every single one of those categories needs to be present now to meet Criterion B for an ASD diagnosis.
Wow. Okay, that is a really, really significant shift from needing maybe half to needing the whole set.
It's a much higher bar, absolutely. And importantly, this change doesn't happen in isolation. You have to look at it alongside Criterion D.
Criterion D, that's one about impairment, right?
Exactly. It states that the symptoms from both Criterion A, the social communication stuff, and Criterion B, the repetitive behaviors we just discussed, must cause clinically significant impairment.
Impairment in what areas?
In social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. So basically, it has to be causing noticeable problems in daily life.
And Dr. Hoerricks connects this to the stricter Criterion B.
Yes, that's their key argument. They say this combination increasingly ties the diagnosis not just to having autistic traits, but to whether those traits cause trouble in specific environments, in a specific place, as they put it.
Can you make that a bit more concrete, like an example?
Sure. Dr. Hoerricks suggests someone, maybe an adult, who definitely has autistic ways of thinking and experiencing the world. Maybe they mask a lot.
Masking being like consciously trying to hide autistic traits.
Exactly. But this person, maybe they have a job, they're housed, they're in a relationship. On the surface, they're functioning.
Okay.
Under these newer criteria, that person might not get diagnosed with autism. Because even with the traits, even with the effort, they don't show that clinically significant impairment in those key areas.
Even if they feel internally that they are autistic.
That's the implication Dr. Hoerricks points to. Another example given is homeschooling. A child's needs might be really well met at home in that specific environment.
So the impairment wouldn't be as obvious as it might be in, say, a busy classroom?
Potentially, yes. If the environment is accommodating, the impairment might be less visible, which could then impact whether a diagnosis is given under these criteria.
So it really emphasizes that functional aspect within a specific context. If you adapt or your environment adapts, maybe no diagnosis.
That's the concern, yeah. It links diagnosis much more tightly to struggling within, let's say, standard societal structures.
Now, the article also mentions SPCD, Social, pragmatic communication disorder. How does that fit in?
Right. So SPCD comes into play when someone has clear difficulties with social communication. It's like criterion A stuff for autism.
Uh-huh.
But they don't meet the new stricter criterion B for ASD. They don't show all those restricted repetitive behaviors.
Okay, so it's like an alternative label.
Yeah.
For people who might have fit under the older, broader autism umbrella but don't meet the new requirements?
You can see it that way, yes. SPCD is mainly about deficits in using communication socially, both verbal and nonverbal.
Like what, specifically?
Things like struggling to use communication appropriately for the social situation, difficulty changing how you talk depending on who you're with,
Okay.
problems using language just to, socialize, understanding cues, nonverbal stuff like body language or understanding things that aren't literal, sarcasm, metaphors.
Can you give some everyday examples of SPCD signs?
Sure. Maybe difficulty taking turns in a conversation, or using very formal language with friends, or maybe being overly casual in formal setting, trouble reading facial expressions,
Yeah.
maybe missing the point of a joke or taking idioms literally, and often real difficulty making and keeping friends because of these communication issues.
But like with ASD, just having one or two issues isn't enough for a diagnosis, is it?
No, definitely not. That's critical. For an SPCD diagnosis, these communication problems have to cause significant interference. They need to mess with relationships, school, work, socializing. It has to be impairing.
And how is it officially different from ASD, according to the DSM-5 TR?
Well, the DSM sees them as separate things. The big difference is that SPCD doesn't include those restricted and repetitive behaviors from criterion B. That's the dividing line. So you can have the social communication challenges, but if you don't have that full suite of repetitive behaviors, you might get SPCD, not ASD.
Right. Okay, so Dr. Hoerricks raises some pretty serious concerns about all these changes. What are the big ones?
Well, a major one is the prediction that autism prevalence might actually go down, not because we understand it better.
Partly because the criteria are just harder to meet.
Exactly. And Dr. Hoerricks puts forward the idea that this could be a form of containment, maybe even driven by worries about the costs associated with autism support in healthcare systems.
Wow, that's a heavy suggestion. That diagnosis could be shaped by economics.
It's provocative, for sure, and it connects to another concern that these changes kind of invalidate the idea of an autistic neurotype just existing on its own.
Meaning, like, your brain is just wired differently, regardless of whether you're struggling in a particular environment.
Precisely. If the diagnosis hinges on failing to function in certain places, does that mean the underlying neurology doesn't count if you are managing? It potentially undermines that core difference.
Which could then impact identity, right?
Absolutely. If your sense of being autistic isn't validated by a diagnosis because you're holding down a job, does that make your experience less real? It's a serious issue for autistic identity and the neurodiversity movement.
And you mentioned earlier, Dr. Hoerricks predicted more self-diagnosis.
Yes, back in 2022. And they feel the 2025 update confirms this. If the formal path gets narrower, more difficult.
People will find their own answers in community elsewhere. Makes sense.
It does. And then there's the concern about SPCD. Dr. Hoerricks calls it a potential cul-de-sac diagnosis.
A cul-de-sac, meaning it doesn't really lead anywhere.
Kind of, yeah. The worry is that getting an SPCD label might acknowledge some communication issues, but it might not unlock the same level of support. Things like school accommodations, therapies, legal protections, they're often more established for an ASD diagnosis.
So you get a label, but maybe not the help you actually need.
That's the fear. It identifies a problem, but might not connect you to the resources. And maybe the most striking point Dr. Hoerricks makes is the assertion that the DSM-5 TR seems to increasingly suggest that autism isn't valid unless it disrupts capitalism.
Okay, unpack that a little.
The idea being, if you can fit into the expected norms of working, consuming, functioning within the current economic system, then maybe your autistic traits aren't seen as a disorder anymore, even if they are core to who you are.
That really forces you to think about who defines these conditions and why, doesn't it? What values are embedded in the diagnostic criteria?
It absolutely does. And just for context, Dr. Hoerricks also briefly touches on Leo Kanner's original 1943 description.
Kanner being one of the first to describe autism.
Right. He talked about an innate inability to form the usual contact with people.
Yeah.
Even then, there was this idea of comparing behavior to social expectations. Diagnostic variation was sort of built in from the start.
And what about how places like schools define it? Special education, IDEA?
Yeah, those definitions usually focus on the impact on communication, social interaction, and crucially, educational performance, often noting it's evident before age 3 and mentioning repetitive behaviors and sensory issues too. It's just interesting to see the slightly different focuses across medicine and education.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. After exploring Dr. Hoerricks' article and these DSM changes, what are the really key points for listeners to take away?
I think the main things are, first, the DSM-5-TR definitely raised the bar for an ASD diagnosis. You now need all 4 types of restricted repetitive behaviors for criterion B, not just 2.
Okay, stricter criteria there.
Second, that change, plus the ongoing focus on clinically significant impairment in key life areas, what Dr. Hoerricks calls place. It really links diagnosis more strongly to struggling in specific environments.
So context and function are more central than ever.
Seems so. Third, there's SPCD, social pragmatic communication disorder. It's now a distinct category for people with social communication issues, but without that full set of repetitive behaviors needed for ASD.
An alternative pathway, potentially.
Potentially. And fourth, Dr. Hoerricks' big concerns. Is autism prevalence going down due to definition changes? Does this undermine the idea of neurotype independent of impairment? And will SPCD actually provide adequate support?
Which loops us back to that powerful starting question from Dr. Hoerricks. Can we actually be autistic, or must we have a disorder that impacts our ability to function in certain context places?
Exactly. It makes you really consider the social, maybe even political side of diagnosis. How much is it about fitting into societal boxes versus understanding neurological difference?
It feels like this deep dive has opened up more questions than answers, maybe.
And that's okay. This is just scratching the surface of a huge ongoing conversation. We really hope this encourages you, the listener, to think more about your own views on neurodiversity.
Yeah, maybe look more into these DSM changes yourself. And really importantly,
Listen to autistic voices, people with diagnoses,
Right.
people who self-identify, hear their diverse experiences directly.
because ultimately our understanding of the mind, it's always shifting, isn't it?
Always. And considering all these perspectives, supporting authentic voices from the community, that feels absolutely vital.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.